2015, which talked about disaster fatigue in terms of post-disaster events like fundraising, memorial services, that kind of thing. Then we had Haiti, and there was a lot of talk about why is the public why are public donations drying up? They're not as forthcoming for the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. And then this was a very interesting article, an uneasy peace in a forgotten war. Once a cause célèbre, Darfur is yesterday's genocide. Overshadowed by misery in Haiti and strife in Afghanistan, Sudan can't compete in a world wearied by disaster fatigue. And then there's a few other various references that I'm not going to go through, but by and large, the references to the phrase disaster fatigue was being used by journalists. And the most recent was by two journalists who wrote for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal this year, talking about the pandemic and using the word disaster fatigue. So in summary, if we move to the next slide, please, Anna. The words compassion fatigue and the associated post-traumatic stress disorder, they're really well documented. To a lesser extent, some people use crisis fatigue, but with 136 mentions across all of CSU's databases, it's not a very well-used term, disaster fatigue. And in all the usages I could find, I think they could have used the word compassion fatigue. And so at this point, you may be wondering why I'm bothering with this term. Why am I pursuing the term disaster fatigue when it's obviously synonymous with compassion fatigue? Well, really, I think it's important because to understand the long-term prolonged effect of cascading disasters, we need to move beyond the effects on frontline workers and public donations drying up. We need to be able to, in all of our disciplines, plan and prepare now for how we can track disaster fatigue, if that's the term that we stick with in Australia. Perhaps we need another term, but I guess my ultimate thesis is that, and the point that I'm leading to is, we ought to be preparing for a nation in disaster fatigue. And what will that look like? And what can we do in preparation for that? Next slide, please. So I'm looking at disaster fatigue on an individual level. But to start with, I'm looking at, for our own benefit, looking at how compassion fatigue is defined in the literature. Medically speaking, this is the medical definition, when stressed, the brain releases cortisol and adrenaline to help cope and inform the automatic fight or flight response. Over time, when we experience this process again and again, our adrenal glands can become fatigued. And as a result of that, what do we see? So I'm saying that it's likely we're going to see poor decision making, increased reaction times, reduced attentiveness, impaired memory, withdrawn moods. And then from, and this comes from a manual for air traffic controllers actually, who have to remain alert and not succumb to fatigue. Fatigue may result in poor decision-making, slow reaction and to changing situations, failure to notice impending conflictions, loss of situational awareness. And my question is, could these criteria, which are applied to individual people, form a starting point for devising the indicators or the criteria of a nation experiencing disaster fatigue? Could these points be extrapolated and enlarged upon? What would they look like if we were looking at a group of people rather than individuals. Next slide, please, Anna. And so the first thing I'm thinking about is, do we repurpose the word disaster fatigue, which at the present time has been conflagrated with compassion fatigue? Do we repurpose it? Do we say compassion fatigue refers to individuals and disaster fatigue refers to groups of people in communities, states, or nations? And the reason that I'm interested in this is, I mean, you may disagree with me here, but every year I have students who come to me and they want to do their research project on post-traumatic stress, and either they want to focus on the training that's provided to new employees or volunteers in their particular service, emergency service, or they want to examine what happens when people do have post-traumatic stress, how they supported, what programs are available to them. And every year I challenge them with the same thing, and I say, perhaps PTSD is not due to some individual weakness, which requires strengthening and building resilience or support. Perhaps it's an organisational change that needs to take place, a paradigm shift within the organisation. Stop blaming the individual and look at the organisation as a whole, and how can that culture experience a, you know, tectonic plate shift so that we're not looking at individuals but an organisational response. The thing is that I feel the same thing coming with disaster fatigue. I feel that if the nation of Australia starts exhibiting whatever the criteria are of national disaster fatigue, that all the programs and all the money and all the effort is going to go to the most easily reachable common denominator, which is individuals and households. And then it becomes our problem as an individual. And I just have a problem with that. I think we need to lift our sights towards leaders, organisations, and national response, rather than targeting the easiest sort of lowest common denominator, which is us as individuals or households. So I'm saying we need a huge paradigm shift in national and societal culture. It's a bit of a blue sky dream, but anyway. So obviously I'm not saying we shouldn't provide support. I accept support for stress relieving activities, but I'm heralding we need to move beyond individual experience to think about the community and nation as a whole, and how we can turn the ship around and generate something positive out of this situation, because it's an opportunity for change. So in the next section, if we move to the next slide, please, Anna, I'm going to look at disaster fatigue through the lens of community and the nation as a whole. So in Australia, we use the term social distancing, but you'll have noticed that internationally, it's more probable that you'll hear the term physical distancing, which is probably more accurate, because you can socially distance digitally, but physical distance relates to location. But whatever your term, it's resulted in prohibiting public gatherings, closed schools, frustrated the exercise regime of many people, and all of it has an unintentional disempowering of community. So the subliminal message is that the community itself is a threat. In the midst of a pandemic, we talk about community transmission, and we're distancing each other geographically from each other at the same time as we're returning to geographical locations. It's a really interesting moment in time. But I find it interesting because it's a very moment when we can coalesce a new understanding of community, but at the same time, community itself is a threat and we're separated from each other physically. So in terms of public health and safety, what can we expect? Well, I think we can see that people are going to feel increasingly insecure and even less safe than at the start of the COVID pandemic. I think we'll also see, which we're already seeing, a bigger wedge between the haves and have-nots. And yeah, I agree with that, Andrew. And, you know, for most of us in a middle-class Western society, we're not used to prolonged rationing of food, fuel, and other commodities. It's new for us, and we hope it goes away. I think I can see that in the future there'll be seminars on how to reinvent yourself. We have to may have to change perceptions of how our lives will look in the future. Obviously, there's going to be a lack of discretionary spending, which could affect the psychology of recovery. And perhaps recovery is not the best word to use, and we need to coin a new descriptor, not only for a nation in disaster fatigue, but also a nation moving forward to reinvent itself at all levels of society. I don't know, but it feels like we're on the cusp of something, and I just can't actually get there just yet. Okay, next slide, please, Anna. Before I move off community, I just wanted to touch on volunteers. So I have got a slide on volunteers, slide 11. Hello, Anna. Yep, thank you, that's it. Okay, so in Australia over the last 12 months, we've been through many disasters, flood, drought, fire, and now the pandemic, and volunteers have struggled to keep up. They've lacked basic resources, they've lacked personal protective equipment, they've lacked, you know, fire trucks, or various bits of equipment. And each disaster has brought new communities in need of recovery and help and thrown thousands of survivors into a complex, already insufficient web of disaster relief. So after a disaster, as we know, there's an eclectic mix of groups, not-for-profits, local organisations, grassroots groups, mutual aid networks, NGOs, neighbourhood centres that come together to help survivors, to meet the needs of survivors. Collectively, volunteers help and often lead a variety of relief efforts, including shelters, search and rescue, medical assistance, distributing donations, clearing debris, rebuilding, and so on and so forth. So volunteering is an established part of our approach to disaster management in Australia. It's actually built into our disaster management planning that we will have volunteers. My concern is that there won't be enough volunteers for the next disaster, that we won't be able to rely on unpaid labour. One of the greatest challenges for communities will be in terms of disaster management language, psychosocial operational readiness, and by extrapolation, the psychosocial operational readiness of our nation. Will Australia have the capacity to continue contributing and relying on such a high level of volunteering? And that leads me into disaster fatigue on the national level, which is the next slide, please, Anna. So how are difficulties in coping with the economic, physical, political, social, emotional impacts of multiple disaster events? You can add a few more criteria there, expressed collectively on a national level. And is it possible that we're already experiencing these criteria, which are yet to be sort of named, and exhibiting collective symptoms, whatever they may be? I think we can probably see the birth pangs of this, and some of them are a reversal and rearrangement of essential versus non-essential workers. So cleaners, people involved in food production and delivery, and hospital personnel. They all have risen to prominence as essential workers. Another thing we can see is political polarisation. So in the midst of, you know, bushfires and COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns, the Black Lives Matter movement surfaced as a focus and release for many varied tensions in America, and consequently ignited similar movements in other countries. Are some of these indicators of a national disaster fatigue crisis? And second last slide, please, Anna, Western perspectives. So I've got 2 points here. One is a very interesting article. There's slideshow will be available if you want with all the references at the end, but 2 people investigated what became important to disaster survivors in a particularly hard-hit hurricane area of Florida, one hurricane after another, and they interviewed victims and survivors and said, what was most important to you in your recovery? And they were kind of blown away with what they found. So it wasn't like donations and money and volunteer help. It was actually a search for meaning in life. They'd been knocked down so many times, they had to do a lot of inner soul searching to say to themselves, come on, let's get up again, let's try again, let's do it again. Let's rebuild the house for the 3rd time. Let's relocate, whatever they were going to do. What was it that provided their motivation? They had to find a meaning for living. And I think that is really interesting because, you know, we've just flicked through. Hang on, we're not at issues raised. We're not at new normal. What's going on? That's right, we're in the right spot there. That's great, Western perspectives. This is really interesting because typically or classically, historically, major disasters have affected developing nations. So Bangladesh wiped out by, you know, a cyclone Ayla or a flooding event. Tsunamis in Indonesia. So huge natural disasters affecting vast numbers of people living in relative poverty. But it's the Western nations who are developing the theories and the practices and the strategies to cope with safety, public safety and disaster. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. And so we look at recovery and the meaning of life through the lens of Western medicine and a scientific approach. And we might need to start thinking about how that affects, it's kind of a hegemonic viewpoint, if you like, about how we look at recovery. The second thing I think is really important is rapid change is possible in times of crisis. And at this point, I think of a mobile phone screen, you know, when you're going to move an icon on your screen and all the little icons wobble and you can move everything across the screen or to another one or whatever. I think we're at that moment in time now as a nation where all the building blocks for recovery are wobbly and they can be moved relatively quickly. And this moment doesn't last for a long time. It's a critical window where we have an opportunity to quickly change policy, institute new approaches and paradigms, rethink and reset. And to bring it closer to home, in the university sector, especially in our university, we've seen that previously totally inflexible deadlines are now happily wavered and courses are deleted, subjects are merged in record speed. And staff are shed, they're moved, they're reassigned in record speed. And very soon that window closes and everything locks down and we go back to the grind. So I think we're obviously, this isn't going to be the last pandemic or the last of cascading disasters. And we need to envisage what we will do in this period when the icons on the phone, the building blocks of disaster management are all wobbly and can speedily be upgraded, changed, or capitalised on in some way. The reason I think it's important is that in this period of crisis, where rapid change is possible, you can get the emergence of a person or a group which is counterproductive to society. It's a nice way of saying an undesirable element can rise and easily take advantage of the situation. So we need to be in a position where there's just as easily those with the greatest good at heart can make those changes. And we'll just move to my last slide, my second last slide, I think now, Anna, please. The new normal and the search for meaning. I love this slide. I couldn't believe I found it. So social distancing creates a mistrust at the exact time where we need to be trusting each other. And we need to actually get together and redefine our community persona. So as individuals, we have voluntarily and individually, forcibly, foregoing various individual freedoms for the greater good of our communities. And as a community, people just want to get back to normal. We just want to get back to how it was, get on with our lives. But a whole new reconstruction is now necessary after the unraveling of the fabric of our community and our nation. In resilience arenas, the term is the new normal. And it means that it's just not possible to go back to the pre-disaster state. You can't erase the memory, the events, or the repercussions of what has happened. Have to adjust and adapt to the new normal. So many people are stuck waiting for a vaccine. They're seeing it as a holy grail, which will revert us as a nation back to pre-COVID days. But it's not going to happen. Yes, we'll get a vaccine, but this will only make us feel safer against a health risk for about 3 months at a time. The bigger picture of economic depression will not be mitigated by a vaccine alone. The question is, are we still all in this together? And the reason I thought of this is, in the midst of the crisis, the COAG got dissolved and we had a national cabinet, people worked together, and now it's disintegrating, that collegiality that we're all aiming for one goal, to serve the nation of Australia. Politicians are back to their posts and lobbing rocks over the fence again. But we have a marvellous opportunity at the moment to devise social and public health policies that channel resources into marginalised communities and support other efforts which will strengthen our resilience for the next round of whatever's to come. So, my closing thoughts. In the coming months and years, the world will continue to see and experience a fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic on a global scale. A major question will be, what will be the indicator of the ability of a nation to collectively bounce back after a series of major traumatising events? Will it be the overall economics of the nation, or the collective psychosocial mental health report of the population, which proves to be the most reliable indicator of successful recovery? And so now we just move to the last slide, please, Anna. And what I've done with this slide is just pull out some of the major points or questions that I've raised, in the hopes that it'll get us thinking, maybe a bit of discussion, or maybe it's a take-home sandwich to cogitate on. But in terms of disaster fatigue, is this term sufficient? Do we need to reappropriate it to apply to groups of people rather than individuals? Or do we need to coin a new term that we can apply to groups of people in what at the moment we're calling disaster fatigue? On a national disaster fatigue level, what does national disaster fatigue look like now? And what will it look like in the future? What are the bits and pieces that we can see now? You know, I was mentioning political polarisation and essential versus non-essential workers, that sort of thing. They don't actually relate to fatigue directly. They're a result of the situation, but I still think they're criteria that need to be tracked. And what will be the indicator of the ability of Australia to collectively bounce back? Will it be the economic situation, which is where we're heading at the moment with you know, the rhetoric going on? Or will it be the psychosocial health of our nation, which I think is far more likely? And community disaster fatigue. How has COVID-19 and the bushfire influence social structures and community engagement? And will we have the capacity to continue contributing and relying on such a high level of volunteering? And are we still all in this together? So that's basically my presentation. And thank you for your time. I hope